2016 was a controversial year. One of the most polarizing elections in modern history divided the country over issues of reproductive rights, racial discrimination, and environmental catastrophe. The economy continued to be a pressing concern as America struggled to remain at the forefront of the developed world. Amidst all of this uproar and controversy, the book Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis by J.D. Vance, was released to a nation already arguing over the fate of the American dream. Hillbilly Elegy manages to give unique insight into a world that most Americans have never experienced or even considered. It points out not only that poverty is an enormous issue in our society, but makes an effort to explain the underlying causes and psychology that allow certain people to get left behind as the world develops without them. Vance strives to point out not only how hard work can lead to success, but how it can fail to do so. He shows that America isn't creating a society where success and prosperity is within reach for all, but allowing whole areas to slip through the cracks as the rest of the world moves on without them. JD emerged from his hillbilly background without basic knowledge of how the rest of the world worked. Vance grew up in one of the poorest regions of the U.S., where self-confessed hillbillies lived for generations without building up the necessary resources to make a change. Vance admits to being wholly unprepared for the things he encountered outside of this world. Despite having a motivated grandmother who encouraged him to work hard throughout his life, he found himself nearly unable to apply for college when the time came. The forms of financial aid were difficult to navigate for uneducated and inexperienced applicants. Even the straightforward questions posed a challenge. When asked about his parent and guardian, Vance was unsure of his response as he had an adoptive absentee ex-stepdad, a geographically distant biological father, and a semi-present mother in and out of rehab, while he unofficially lived with his grandmother. After overcoming insurmountable odds and attending Yale Law, JD was interviewing for positions at a law firm. He showed up in military boots and a wrinkled shirt simply because he didn't know that this was unacceptable. Vance walked out of the hillbilly world able to shoot a gun and make a mean biscuit, but unaware of many modern social norms. This is an issue that goes beyond typical academic education. These are things most learn simply by living, and yet JD had no exposure to this form of common sense, and no one to give him the necessary intellectual resources. This left him unprepared to enter the world. But how can our nation teach these things to a culture that is unaware of their existence? How does America ensure that people have access to necessary knowledge outside of academic education? JD's grandparents left their families as early teens and managed to get jobs and make enough money to live comfortably, which was significantly more than peers of the same background and yet still less than the vast majority of Americans. His grandparents spent years trying to make a better life for their children, rescuing his aunt from an abusive relationship and repeatedly paying for his mother's rehab. Yet neither of the grandparents ever finished high school. They could never truly escape their background and were constantly surrounded by addiction and crime and continued struggling to survive until their death. Meanwhile, the wealthy were growing up in a place where they truly could achieve whatever they dreamed of doing. Donald Trump tells of the difficulties of his early life by explaining that he had to pay a $1 million loan back to his father, with interest. While Donald complains of having to pay interest, JD and his peers were hiding under their beds as their mothers threw pans and yelled at their fathers. The poor undoubtedly have a disadvantage when it comes to resources for financial success, and yet their problem is deeper than simple economics. Despite the trauma, obvious resource inequality, and immense challenges JD faced when conquering the outside world, he claims the most damaging psychological issue is the hopelessness surrounding the hillbillies in their homelands. After seeing generations of their people work hard only to end up back where they started, many lose faith that anything more is possible. They feel that their choices don't make any difference and don't bother trying. Most of the children aren't taught to look beyond where they are. While middle-class parents encourage their kids to dream big and aim high, the hillbilly lower class blame their failure on others and give up. With no relatable role models, the people lose hope and resign themselves to failure. JD managed to escape the fate of his peers. He entered the upper middle class and saw Congress work nobly to pass a bill that would restrict payday loans. The government saw these as taking advantage of the less fortunate, and yet JD had relied on them to pay rent or buy textbooks. Vance saw the government made up of the middle and upper classes trying to solve the long-standing issues of the lower class. They threw money at the problem and gave welfare to those they felt were in need. Vance saw these same needy people buy liquor with the government money and leave their children hungry. Where JD saw a deep cultural problem, those in power saw a purely economic one. Hillbilly Elegy works to show the deep complexities behind poverty, to help those in power understand that it is an issue beyond simply financial reform. JD strives to show the problems in the American system that we have created for ourselves. This is a system in which poverty bars people from moving up due to an established tradition of abuse and failure. The systemic issues within our nation can't be overlooked simply because a few managed to make it to a more successful place. Vance made it out, but that doesn't change the fact that in one of the richest countries in the world, there is still an entire subculture that needs escaping from. JD points out the ignorance of the government representatives who have never experienced anything but privilege and wealth and yet try to solve the problems of the nation's poorest people without understanding their true causes. JD points out not only the lack of diversity in the government, but the lack of knowledge or effectiveness in their short sighted reforms. He shows not only what growing up poor is like, but why. As America becomes more increasingly divided, our issues become more pronounced, not less. As the government remains a conglomerate of upper class white privilege and the poorest regions of the nation continue into economic and cultural depression, America must ask itself, why is this really happening? How can we address poverty as more than just an economic issue? How can we overcome the traditions of a society built upon abuse and addiction where children aren't nurtured or encouraged? These questions can only be answered as the people of the nation come together and collaborate to make JD's story the rule and not the exception.